Okay, my name is Toshia Ueki, Executive Vice President of Tohoku University. It is indeed my great honor and privilege to welcome all of you and to offer the opening remarks for today's memorable event, the opening commemorative lecture of the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies of Tohoku University. The Center for Integrated Japanese Studies of Tohoku University was established in October last year. In recent years, Tohoku University has played a strong focus on promoting research in the field of humanities and social sciences, and Japanese studies has played a key role in these efforts. The foundation of the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies represents one of the most important steps in this initiative. As all of you may know well, Tohoku University has been selected as only one final candidate university in Japan for the accreditation for the International Research Excellence Program, which will be financially supported by so-called 10 trillion yen university fund, 10 兆円 university fund by the Japanese government. Once the accreditation is granted, the center is expected to become a core research institute in the field of humanities and social sciences in Tohoku University. A formal introduction of the center is coming up later by Professor Yanagihara, who is the director of the center. But I'd like to introduce that we are extending an invitation to top researchers from all over the world to join us at the center as full-time faculty. In addition to assembling this group of global top-level researchers, the center will promote joint research between its own faculties and many other scholars from Tohoku University, other universities in Japan, and from all over the world. In this way, we will develop furthermore the Japanese studies and lead humanities and social sciences in Japan to new heights of excellence, with the goal of bringing this field of study to global stage and positions of international prominence. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Professor Carol Gluck of Columbia University and Professor Michael Bodash of the University of Chicago, who have kindly traveled from the United States to here in Sendai. I would like to deeply appreciate for joining us today. Both Professor Gluck and Professor Bodash will join the advisory committee of the center, and Professor Gluck will be appointed as a special faculty member of the center starting this April. Today, the two professors will speak from a global perspective on the future of humanities and social sciences and the way that Japanese studies can develop to meet the demand of the future. It is indeed a great pleasure and an honor to be able to launch the center with these special lectures by these two internationally acclaimed professors. Together with all of you, I'm very much looking forward to hearing their insights. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I strongly believe that all of you could enjoy today's excellent lectures. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ueki Sensei. The next speaker is Professor Yanagihara, and he will introduce the goals and the organization of the center. お願いします。
Welcome, and thank you for participating. I'm Toshiaki Yanagihara, the director of Center for Integrated Japanese Studies. I will introduce the center. In Japan, humanities and social science fields are assigned less importance than the natural sciences, medicine, engineering, and other fields in the so-called hard sciences. At the same time, there are increasing calls for academic collaboration between disparate disciplines in the sciences, humanities and social sciences, with the potential to contribute to resolving the range of issues and challenges facing contemporary society. I have heard that the institutional position of Japanese studies has been facing difficulties in recent years, particularly for those seeking academic employment. Tohoku University's social sciences and humanities faculties have undertaken several initiatives in recent years to address this situation. One of these involved the creation of a network of international Japanese studies researchers, the Hasekura League. The name is derived from the Sendai feudal retainer, Hasekura Tsunenaga, a name which can be said to be synonym for progressive character. The Hasekura League, launched in 2015, has grown into a network linking more than 30 universities in Europe, North America, and Oceania, holding annual international symposiums and publishing a series of books with authors from member schools. We plan to expand this league to global scale, including Asia and Africa. In September 2022, we had the Hasekura Summit in Sendai, to which deans and presidents of 7 overseas universities and 43 faculty members and students from 25 universities in 14 countries were invited to discuss the future of the social sciences and humanities, with a focus on Japanese studies. Another initiative is the establishment of the International Joint Graduate School of Japanese Studies, which aims to train scholars able to play an active role internationally in Japanese studies. With this as a background, Tohoku University launched the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies, CIJS, in October 2023, last year. By the end of the initial plan in 2027, we intend to gather 15 young and mid-career Japanese studies researchers of any nationality and create a base for future Japanese studies research. While focusing on the humanities, we plan on expanding the scope of Japanese studies to include social sciences and data science. The word integration, in the name of the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies, has multiple meanings. First, It signals our mission to bridge the gap between the rigorous empirical methods that characterize research in Japan and methods that emphasize theory and conceptual understanding that are prevalent overseas. Next, it refers to our plan to build a large-scale digital archive centered on Tohoku University's academic assets that will serve as a mechanism to integrate data science and humanities and social sciences. The third form of integration at the heart of the CIJS is the integration of diverse academic fields in order to produce new and innovative research. In connection with the second point, Tohoku University's academic assets include the Kano Bunko, which has over 100,000 items composed mainly of materials showing the culture of the Edo period. And the Natsume Soseki collection, bringing together a collection of roughly 2,000 books and documents connected to the iconic modern novelist. Tohoku University has numerous other academic assets. Ancient documents dating back to the Middle Age, archaeological research materials, including important cultural properties, Buddhist studies resources. The center's faculty members will collaborate with other Tohoku University scholars and researchers around the world on research projects and contribute to the true internationalization of social sciences and humanities research in Japan. Specifically, we plan on publishing the results of this collaborative research in English language book series and in the new English language Japanese studies journal. At the end of January, we began recruiting internationally for 3 permanent faculty members at the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies. The successful candidates will be appointed as a tenure-track faculty members on October 1st, 2024, this year. That's all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Yanagihara Sensei. Now, let's move on to the lectures. We're going to switch the chair.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher Craig, and I am the head of research and international development at the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies. Right now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the day, Professor Carol Gluck. Professor Gluck is the George Sampson Professor Emerita of History and the founder and chair of the Committee for Global Thought, both at Columbia University. Her scholarship includes extensive work in the fields of modern Japanese history and historiography, as well as global history. And she's currently at work on books on World War II in history and memory, and the historiography of modern Japan. In the coming school year, Professor Gluck will be joining us as a specially appointed professor and special advisor at the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies. So I now ask you to please join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Carol Gluck.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. all of you who have spoken and all of you who have come today. I am delighted to be here and honored at the launch of the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies, which I think is a landmark, potential landmark, not only in the history of Tohoku Daigaku, but in terms of Japanese studies worldwide. It's a new era, I think, of innovation and also opportunity to create the university of the future. But first, I suppose I should start with the weight of the past. Is universities as institutions, can I turn it off? Universities as institutions are extremely difficult things to change. Our modern research universities, and that includes Tohoku Daigaku, it includes Columbia University, where I teach, and it includes the University of Chicago, where Professor Bordash teaches, were largely constructed on 19th century German models seeking scientific knowledge under the sign of the nation state. And our categories of knowledge, many of our disciplines themselves, including sociology, history, economics, physics, biology, and others, also date from the 19th century. And that is not last century, but 1 century before that. And indeed, if you look at the words that you heard already mentioned today, words that are used in seeking to transform Tohokudai and other universities, these words precisely counter these long-time legacies. And that's why we speak of global and transnational in order to transcend the boundaries of the nation state. And we call for interdisciplinary and integrated study to overcome our inherited disciplinary silos. In short, we are working our way out from under the weight of the past. That is never easy to do. But there are certain times in history that make it easier to change ideas and institutions. And I believe that we are living in such a time of genuine and long-term historical transition, of so-called polycrisis, many crises piled up on top of one another, and uncertainties all around, but also of opportunity to direct the kind of change that Tohokudai is embracing with this new center. It takes money, but I've heard you have some of that. It also takes strategy, it takes flexibility, and it also takes collective will to rise to the challenge of our times. And that's what I mean by meeting the moment. And I will say at the start that I am optimistic about the prospect of doing this. I'll talk about 4 challenges of this moment. It's largely on my own field, which is history, and my own experience in the United States, and to some degree in Japan and Europe. So this is 4 of many, I suppose. 1, intellectual challenges of transforming our scholarly approach to research, in this case in Japanese studies. 2nd, pedagogical challenges of changing our ways of teaching, since research and teaching both develop best when they do so together. The 3rd is institutional challenges, the challenges of creating spaces for new work and connecting those new spaces with others that exist across the university and with society and the world at large. And lastly, number 4, historical challenges. Those are the challenges of meeting the moment in this time of historical transition by identifying issues of the future already in the present. So I'll start where our speakers have already begun, which is with intellectual challenges. And the first of 2 I'd like to mention is the first one is to place Japan in global context. This is the call that we are hearing to transcend national borders, escape the prison house of national history, and otherwise avoid the habits of methodological nationalism. Now, this is an easy definition because it's negative, not national. That doesn't help us create a positive idea of this kind of approach. Some say that the answer to that is globalization, which is not a new phenomenon in world history, only its latest and most intensive or extensive, I think, phase. But what does globalization consist of? Is it interdependence? Is it flows? Is it transnational forces? Is it planetary issues like climate? Globalization is a process. It's not a thing. And it's not something that we're able to easily define. Is it our globalization, their globalization, whose globalization? And are we all equally globalized? Of course not. So such questions about the global are similar to those we used to ask about the modern. When I began to study history many, many years ago in the United States in the 1970s, modernization was the process of focus for history and social sciences. Over time, we learned not to define modernity in terms of the West, not to treat modernization in universal terms. I think the same is true of globalization now. In short, we need to be careful with the global. Globalization and the global can be a misleading, if comfortable, abstraction, just the way that modernity and modernization were in decades past. So instead of the global, scholars increasingly prefer the word transnational, which is neither a subject nor a process, but an approach that may mean, for example, treating phenomena that run between nations, like migration or trade, or it may mean looking at one topic in more than one setting, or it may mean focusing on regional, imperial, or multilateral relations. Those are sort of directly transnational subjects and approaches. Now, there are wonderful studies of transnational connections. I'll give you one, for example. There's a book called The Mushroom at the End of the World by the anthropologist Anna Tsing, which follows Matsutake, the mushroom, from their Southeast Asian pickers who pick the mushrooms in the forests of Oregon in the United States, across oceans and nations through the channels of global capitalism. It is obviously a transnational approach and a transnational migration or move that the author is tracing. But many of our subjects of research are less directly transnational than those mushrooms. And they require a different approach to thinking beyond the nation. Here are two ways in which my own work has changed in this transnational direction without actually doing directly transnational history. But I think they may also apply to scholars in other disciplines of Japanese studies as well. Now, the first of my moves, if you like, in the transnational or global direction has to do with what I call thinking elsewhere. I begin any research focused squarely and deeply, locally and specifically on the topic at hand. In my case, it might be history and memory, the Meiji Restoration, or the nature of Japan's post-war, Sengo. So I begin like the proverbial frog in the bottom of a scholarly well. I see only a very small piece of the sky. Then, as I work empirically, to use the term that was used before, I gradually lift my eyes, moving up over the top of the well, and began to peer around at the larger historical expanses outside the well of my topic. I confess that this broader view can be disorienting at first. It's a little bit like the prisoner emerging from Plato's cave into the bright light of the sun. It's actually easier to go back down. But To avoid being overwhelmed by what is essentially my ignorance of the wider world, I've come to focus on 4 perspectives that happen all to begin with the letter C. And they are connections, comparisons, commonalities, and above all, context. I'll give you 2 examples of the 4 C's. The first one is commonalities in global context. That's 2 of the 4 C's. This simply means that I ask what is happening at the same or earlier times in relation to my topic in other places. In other words, global context, if you like. My understanding of war memory, for example, emerged from looking at how other societies apart from Japan remembered the Second World War, which led me to propose an analytic framework for the way public memory operates everywhere in the contemporary world, including Japan. And those of you who know my small book in Japanese, Senso no Kyoku, War Memory, will see what I mean about this, the benefits of global context in studying war memory in Japan. In short, when I looked outside Japan for this project, I saw commonalities, and above all the global context, for the insistently national, often nationalistic narrative of the Second World War that you find in every country. And ever since then, I have been working very hard to keep the world in World War II. Now, I'm a historian of Japan. I'm not a scholar of global history, and I'm not a transnational historian. But I do now think of every subject, every topic, every question, historical, political, economic, social, cultural, in terms of commonalities and global context. Now, I guess I confess to you that at the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia, they often say that in global context is my middle name. Carol in global context Gluck. Well, that's okay with me. I've learned to live with it. It's actually pretty aptly describes the way I go about things these days. So that's the first example of how to be a transnational scholar without actually doing cross-border work, if you like. A second example is a third C, comparison, although it's what I call the comparative frame. Again, it's very indirect. I avoid direct comparison wherever possible, because when you compare 2 terms, 2 countries, 2 societies, 2 persons, or what you notice first is difference, always. And often, not just difference, but inferiority. Us and them, self and other, Greeks and barbarians, Japan and China. And you are liable to the distorting effects of the logic of opposites. So the comparative frame that I'm mentioning is not a method so much as a way of seeing, a habit of looking. I cast my eye on similar phenomena in other places, not to compare them frontally, but to recognize first the commonalities, and I insist on that. What do they have in common, and only then the differences, to reverse the logic of opposites. Once these are recognized, the comparative frame can fall away. You can forget it. Like Wittgenstein's famous ladder, except that Wittgenstein regarded the ladder of logical propositions only as useful to gain a better view, but devoid of any sense in itself. Whereas I think that historical comparisons are filled with meaning. They enable historians to see their subject more clearly, though the comparisons need not be mentioned on the page, or as in my case, they may make only the briefest of rhetorical appearances. If you read my work, you will see the recurring phrase, as elsewhere, in Japan, as elsewhere. But those 2 words, as elsewhere, I assure you, conceal a great deal of research and thought before I can even come to that. Here's an example. It's one of my favorite. from a conversation that I, an intellectual historian of modern Japan, 20th century Japan, once had with a social historian of 19th century France over lunch, when the French scholar told me he was researching the myth of the immobile peasant in France. I was really surprised, and I said, "Oh, your peasants don't move either?" He didn't know why I was surprised. But it was because my first response was to think of the social fable of the Tokugawa era shogunate, that peasants do not move because they ought not move from their place of registry. The French historian and I then proceeded to ask one another very specific questions about how and why the Japanese and French state, vastly different though they were at that time, both attempted, neither successfully, to keep peasants in one place, and how the myth of the immobile peasant was used and by whom. Our conversation went on to past the time the restaurant closed in late afternoon, and we both gained new insights from this comparative exchange, despite my ignorance of France and his ignorance of Japan. Neither of us ever mentioned the other country in our writing, but we each came to ask different questions of our own subject because of that border-crossing comparative conversation. And that's what I mean about the comparative frame. You can't notice it in the work, but it's what causes you to ask the questions you ask and answer them the way you do. And this is what I call thinking elsewhere. Thinking elsewhere about global context and employing a comparative frame in the study of modern Japanese history and society has the effect of taking one outside the canonical, conventional confines of national history or sociology or whatever, and outside the worn-out binary of East and West into the wider world of commonalities and connections. In effect, this is thinking beyond the nation, even if one isn't doing it in the terms of quite sort of, I don't know, specifically transnational history. Although I do that kind of work too, and I have certainly in my work on public memory, because that's dependent on my understanding the things that cross between nations, not only occur within them. My point, though, and I think this is in terms of the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies, is that one can stand squarely in your Japanese topic. In my case, that might be Meiji social protests in Ashio, or Japanese history writing, to give two examples from my own work. And you can stand there and still far better understand these local or national histories for having brought other parts of the world into view. So that's one kind of integration that one can do to keep Japan in global context. A second intellectual challenge, apart from the global context challenge, is the need for interdisciplinarity, which you hear over and over today. It's part of the word, as Yanagihara Sensei said, of integrated Japanese studies. And it's part of what I think of as following the question. First, of course, you have to ask the question. That's the mondai teiki. In many periods in the long history of scientific research, the large questions have been determined by the dominant trends of the time, whether they were theological questions in medieval Europe, developmental questions in modern capitalism, or political questions in the transition from monarchy to parliamentary systems. But this, I believe, is not the case today. Our questions have not been given us. There are no dominant trends of the time. There are just old trends that keep existing in our time, but they are not of our time. Because, as I said at the beginning, this is a time of historical transition. It's a specific historical conjuncture that began at least during the last third of the 20th century and maybe much before that, and still continues today, which is the important part of it. The large questions of our time are not set for us even as our long, dominant theoretical models, whether they're Marxist, liberal, developmental, or whatever, no longer hold. We live in the land of paradigms lost, and this means researchers can, and I say must, ask their own questions and find their own ways to answer them. Now, to do that requires multiple methodologies, employing the tools of several disciplines. It's obvious that human and planetary experience never occurs in neat disciplinary boxes. We all know that from our own lives, and yet when we study other people's lives, we divide them up. To be true to that experience, the researcher needs to follow the question wherever it leads, and that often means using other tools, whether they might be tools of economics, law, anthropology, political science, whatever, biology, neuroscience. Now, individual scholars, and this will come as a relief, I'm sure, do not need to master all these disciplines. That would be beyond all of us. But we do need to be open to them. And being open to them is already a big step. I'll give you an example, which is a study of change during the Meiji period from burial of the dead in Japan to cremation of the dead, which is no small change in human life and death and ritual. To study that requires not only religious and cultural approaches, it also requires attention to the economics of taxation and the politics of urban development. This was an early Meiji phenomenon. Just think about cemeteries and the land they occupy in the middle of Tokyo. So it's an openness to other aspects of a question that bring the integration of the subject to bear. Now, when groups of scholars, as opposed to the individual, when groups of scholars from different disciplines work together, challenge is a little different. For the study to be truly interdisciplinary, each of the people involved needs to learn the methods of their collaborators, not simply work side by side with them in the same room in a kind of academic parallel play. That is not interdisciplinarity. That's side by side. An international project that I participated in and led for several years on the politics of memory in global context. I'll give an example of this. We had 3 groups of scholars from all over the world, but in terms of their disciplines. One were scholars in the social sciences and humanities who study collective or public memory. The second group were researchers in cognitive science, psychology, and neuroscience who study memory in individual memory in the brain. And the third group were curators of historical and memorial museums who convey the past to the public in material ways. Now, these were very, very different groups of people. The curators are public historians. The neuroscientists are hard natural scientists. And the humanities and social science are, where I was, are soft in comparison anyway, as soft and academic in comparison. So over time, and it took a long time, I'll be honest about this, we learned enough of one another's disciplines, of the questions that the others asked and the approaches that they used, that we were able together to untangle analytic knots that neither group, that any of the groups, could succeed in doing on its own. It actually worked. It took several years, and now I think as a result, our individual work going apart from that project is now informed. My own work in memory is informed by neuroscience in a way that I would never have thought to do. So that's the kind of interdisciplinarity that can happen in group collaborations. As the new center meets these two, and there are more, but these two intellectual challenges, Japan in global context, and following the question across disciplines, I think that the center does offer the promise of a truly, to use the words of the moment, transnational and interdisciplinary, that is to say, integrated study of Japan. Now, a second set of challenges is pedagogical. How do we teach students to meet the moment of historical transition in which they find themselves? I mean, to be honest, our teaching methods have probably changed even less than the intellectual approaches over the course of the history of modern universities. It's still lectures, seminars, laboratories. Instructors transmitting, students receiving, sometimes Socratic discussion and collaborative scientific experiment, but still a tradition of relatively passive learning. The promise or the peril, depending on your point of view, of new technologies, whether digital humanities, big data, electronic translation, or chat GPT, has enlarged the range of our sources and expanded the realms of knowledge. Yet we still tend to deploy them as we once did books and scientific treatises, as tools for passive learning. And yet what we need now is active learning, the kind of active thinking that can lead to thoughtful action. This is not the same thing as critical thinking, because I think faculty and students today are quite good at critical thinking, at least in terms of criticizing the work of others, because we've been taught how to do that. And we teach others how to do that. But we are better, this kind of critique is better at absorbing than creating, better at answering old questions than posing new ones, and better at analyzing ideas than generating them. Here are two examples of recent trends in the United States that I've been a part of to introduce what is sometimes called making and doing. Sometimes it's called project-based learning. Sometimes it's called experiential learning into university classrooms. The goal is to have students ask their own questions and find their own ways to answer them without the usual scaffolding, prompts, and guidelines for doing that. My first example of this is what I think of as doing research without a net, the way acrobats in the circus fly through the air with nothing to catch them if they fall. Okay. Now this is built into the Masters in Global Thought offered by Columbia's Committee on Global Thought, which I've been part of since it began in 2006. And as I often say about this master's program, the best thing about global thought is that no one knows what it is. This is very useful because for students, that means there is no set methodology, there is no set research template, no prescribed format of study. There is no answer in this classroom because this is not something that is defined. So students have on their own to identify a problem that they're going to research, and then they also have to find the approaches to researching it. Now, we urge them to start in the middle, in media res, with empirical research, and not with existing theory or state-of-the-field scholarly reviews. Because the goal is to have their own ideas, rather than begin by working within the confines of the ideas of others, whether you're critical of them or you want to extend them, at least at the beginning of the research. Eventually, of course, they read secondary literature and they understand the state of the field, but not at the beginning. The assignment is confusing and uncomfortable, and a lot of students push back because they're not used to it. They're not used to doing research without a net, is what it comes down to. But with instructors' counsel along the way, They all get there, and the final results are often spectacularly original. Another path, similar to active learning, that is gaining ground in US classrooms is collaborative projects. Now, Kyoto Kenkyu is a long-standing tradition in Japanese academic life. But Kyoto Kenkyu tends to be people working on the similar or the same topic from different points of view. And the essays that they write will be collected in a ronbunshu or whatever. This is not the same thing, different kind of collaboration, if you like. For us, it was a gift of the pandemic. We had students in the Masters in Global Thought zooming in from all over the world for an entire academic year, never once meeting face to face. And we wanted both to take advantage of their locations by having them do research locally. We also wanted to connect them with one another by working together on the same topic, if in different places, because we were thinking of them as a cohort of students who wouldn't have met one another. We created a course called Local Global Worlds, and we divided the class into collaborative groups of 4 students each. And we asked them first to find a topic that seemed important to them as a group of 4. I told them my own recipe for good: ask big questions, address them with deep empiricism, and do so with fire in the belly, meaning choose a topic you really care about. Once the groups decided on their topic collectively, they then did their research individually and locally, deploying diverse disciplinary tools to answer the questions that they collectively posed. At the end, they were charged with presenting a single collective argument, not 4 individual reports on the same topic. They had to weave them together into an argument, and they didn't even present their own work. They presented the argument, which might mean presenting somebody else's work as part of the argument. And this phase required a lot of hard thinking to knit together the research they'd done. So I'm going to give you an example of some of the stunning results that showed how from the local came the global, from the global came the local, etc., in extremely creative ways. This is a group that decided to focus on the impact of Tesla, the electric car company. The students were located in Northern California, Silicon Valley, in Copenhagen in Denmark, in Berlin, Germany, and in Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In Silicon Valley, the home of high-tech unicorns, startup billionaires, the story involved techno-romanticism, hyper-capitalism, and profit, and profit, and profit. In Copenhagen, the advent of Tesla coincided with the Danish government's new energy policy, which provided tax relief for electric vehicles as part of a forward environmental policy, providing Tesla with a positive welcome in Denmark. But in Berlin, where Tesla was proposing at that point, planning to build a gigafactory, its first in Europe and the largest, even now, in Europe, the environmental response of green and environmental groups and parties was very strongly opposed because of the destruction of the forests and also because of the effect on the water supply to the city of Berlin. This is an opposition that created a very rocky road for the factory, which echoes today in a more recent fight on its expansion. And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which produces more than 2/3 of the world's cobalt used in the lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles, the story was the all-too-familiar one of exploitation of natural resources on colonial models, only this time the power and the profit rests largely in the hands of Chinese companies, which supply African cobalt to Tesla. By posing an open-ended question, conducting research in 4 different local situations, and looking at the results, linking them in various political, economic, social, and ideological aspects, the students generated a genuinely global and innovative depiction of the way parts of the world work today. It was brilliant, and there were lots of others like that. The result of all of these results is that we have continued this course and added others in terms of these collaborative, border-crossing, interdisciplinary projects, which begin without an existing conceptual or theoretical formula, and which, in our case, build the global from the local, though not necessarily focusing on a single location. That just happened to be geographical. The topic can be a policy, it can be an event, it can be a work of art, including a 14th century one in one case. The point is the specificity of the approach, starting with small rather than big, and moving from micro, floods in Bangladesh, to macro, the nature and the future of the Anthropocene. Now, this collaborative project-based learning works in every field. I've used the same approach ever since in Paris for the master's program in history and literature. I've used it in undergraduate courses in World War II. I've used it in graduate courses in modern Japanese history. The approach is similar, of course, the content is completely different. So we're back, if you like, to the 4 C's: commonalities, connections, comparisons, and contexts, surrounding the differences in individual topics around a larger question that produce conclusions no one had imagined before starting the research. It's the most creative pedagogy I've ever encountered. It's very exciting. And by the end of the work, the students uniformly say it was the most creative learning they had ever done. Now, of course, there are many other paths to active learning and thinking. I'm just giving you examples from my world. But this seems to be one of the tasks we have ahead of us. It's one of the great pedagogical challenges of our time, one that the new Center for Integrated Japanese Studies here is well equipped to address, because you have the pieces to do this kind of work. The third set of challenges is maybe harder, institutional challenges. Because if resistant research practices and teaching customs may be hard to change, but they're easier to change than the structure and culture of academic institutions. I don't have to tell you. Yet that's what we have to do. That's what we're saying now, that we have to change the structure and culture of the university. That's what the whole project, the whole national project is about, right? That's the innovation that people are looking for. I'll make 4 suggestions from my own experience with the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia that I think might be relevant to the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies. The first one is the advantage of what I call a third space. This simply means that it is easier to start something new than work against the institutional grain in established disciplines, schools, departments, and curricula. Rather than take one side or another, or get into somebody else's soup and have them be upset about it, starting in a third space, an empty space, a new space, which does not threaten or seem even to impinge on entrenched interests, offers signal advantages institutionally. This is the story of the Committee on Global Thought, CGT as we call it. It's not a department or an institute or a center, but an institutionally anomalous pan-university group of Columbia faculty from the arts and sciences and nearly every professional school, including the medical school and public health. It is transnational and interdisciplinary, collaborative and creative, a place for conversation across disciplinary and departmental borders, which is why its faculty likes to be there. Every one of the faculty says what they like about the CGT is that they are talking across borders to people they normally would not work with in their own departments. Well, it seems to me that the International Research Institute for Disaster Science at Tohoku-dai, the Saigai Kagaku Kokusai Kenkyū, is this kind of innovative institution. It's created in a third space, from what I understand, and I think that the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies will be too. But it only succeeds in that space if that space is not walled off from the rest of the university. And you've already seen that mentioned. This is my second institutional suggestion for meeting institutional challenges. It's what I've come to think of as open arms. A new academic formation should not be a gated community, but rather invite others into its work, offering the opportunity for participation, conversation, and collaboration. At the Committee on Global Thought, we often ask faculty across the university and beyond, what can the CGT do for you? How can we help? And we offer incentives to join in projects, sometimes monetary, sometimes administrative help. Over time, the new kid on the block, if you like, the new academic institution, in our case the CGT, came to be seen not as competition to existing departments, but as an opportunity for others to make connections across the university lines. It's kind of a if you build it, they will come principle. And everyone in and outside the CGT or in and outside the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies stands to benefit. It's a win-win sort of idea. It's especially important, I think, for this new center that the new international faculty who are being hired reach out and work with their Japanese counterparts across the university so that this not become a separate space or a ghetto of integrated Japanese studies. And of course, this reaching out extends beyond Tohokudai to its many global relationships and networks, including the Hasekura League and others. This is more than faculty and student exchange. I should emphasize that. We've all been exchanging faculty and students forever. It's more than that. It's true conversation and collaboration among students, among faculty in different places. Sometimes they may never even meet in one place. In this regard, reaching out with open arms often means asking open-ended questions. When the CGT collaborates with Columbia's 11 global centers around the world, we are likely to begin any such conversation with what is most important to you in Istanbul, Rio, Mumbai, wherever, about whatever the subject is. The future of universities, cybersecurity, the energy transition, the new novel, etc. We ask open questions rather than predetermine the research or conference agenda ourselves. In other words, the open arms involves open-ended questions that means real collaboration from the beginning in terms of this kind of integration of the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies with the rest of the university and the wider world. Now, a third institutional suggestion has to do with organizational leveling. This is a tough one. Creating new organizations in third spaces offers the chance to escape our inherited academic hierarchies and instead level relations within the center or within the CGT so that junior faculty, postdoctoral researchers, graduate students, undergraduate, and senior faculty can work together. This not only benefits younger people, but their seniors as well. Leaving seniority at the door, new hires as well as old, international as well as Japanese faculty can come together in a community of scholars, at least in this academic space. Now, I said I was an optimist, but I'm not crazy. And I realize that I'm optimistic at suggesting that such organizational level is an easy thing to achieve. It doesn't come naturally, not only in Japanese, but anywhere, at universities everywhere. Still, I think one thing to strive for is a relatively flat, horizontal organization. It's certainly one of the best things about the Committee on Global Thought. There's no question that that's worked. I mean, they all have their hierarchies in their own departments. When they come to the CGT, they don't have one. And it seems to come as a relief. The Committee on Global Thought includes everything but undergraduates to provosts to people in New York City and around the world. So it's not simply an academic hierarchy. So leveling is at least an ambition to have, I would say. And the fourth institutional principle at Columbia is now known as the fourth purpose. Columbia's previous president, Lee Bollinger, added to the pursuits of research, teaching, and public service a fourth purpose of contemporary research universities, which is to utilize scholarly knowledge to create social and global impact in the real world, usually in partnership with organizations outside the academy. Now, the motto of the fourth purpose is thinking and doing, and it inspires faculty and students to put their research and knowledge to work in society. It seems to me that the Institute of Disaster Science, for example, is a fourth purpose entity. And not everyone at the university is engaged in fourth purpose work. At the CGT, we're teaching, thinking and teaching, not thinking and doing. But it's, I think, a good purpose to have in mind. It's part of the stated mission of an institution to be of use in the world. It would also, by the way, help the reputation of universities in society, at least in the United States. And finally, those are the four institutional challenges. Finally, the historical challenge. Now, I've said at the beginning that I believe that we are living in a time of historical transition, rather long one, and it's not over yet. When it does end, historians will give it a name, but right now it has no name. It's like the Renaissance. The Renaissance wasn't the Renaissance until centuries later. At some point, the period we're living in will have a name, but we don't know what it is because we don't know how it's going to end or what the future will bring. The way we're between periods, it's between paradigms, between peaks. The German philosopher Reinhard Koselleck used to talk of Sattelzeit, a saddle period, the horse's saddle that is shaped like this, between periods. For him, it was around the turn of the 18th century before modernity set in Europe. For us, we know what it's after, we don't know what it's before, but we're definitely, I think, in this kind of a period. And if you think, as I do, that scholars in modern times now, this is for several centuries, have always engaged with the past and present with a view toward the future, then it matters what questions you ask about the present, especially if you can't see the future. You can't hypothesize it. You don't have a mythology of progress. You're not sure things are always going to go in one direction, which is the uncertainties of our moment. So the questions you ask are really important. So it's Mondai-teiki again. Now, for Marx in the mid-19th century, the question was capitalism. For many years since then, it was modernity, formation of the modern nation-state, the Industrial Revolution, quantum theory and relativity, the emancipation of the post-colonial world, the social oppressions of peoples and gender inequities, and so on. So the question we have to ask ourselves is what aspects of our times seem to matter most? Seem to matter most, and what I mean by that is seem to matter in terms of the way the world is going. People think, some, that the most pressing global question today is the relation between equality and inequality within and across societies. Other people think it is dealing with climate and the Anthropocene. And still others with the dwindling supply of water, demographic explosion in the global, the threat to labor of AI, and so on. It's hard to see the most pressing questions, the questions that matter most, in a period of historical transition because we are in the middle of them and they are, as I said, piled one on top of one another. It's hard in a saddle time because we can't really project, or we're not able to project the future. But whatever Japan and the world are going to be in the future, when the saddle time ends, let's say, the fact is that the ingredients that will form that future are happening now. That's the way history works. It doesn't work by events that change things between a night and a morning. But works by seemingly unconnected swirls and streams and strands that eventuate, if you like that word, into something different, which scholars then name and explain. In other words, it becomes the future, but the future is happening now. So what parts of the future do you want to emphasize? Do you want to study? Do you want to change? Now's the time to figure that out. So our biggest challenge would be to try to understand history while it's happening, the changes in society, economics, in biology, whatever, you name it, to figure out why it's happening and not wait for it to turn out when it's easy, right? Then it's an easy story to tell. Because I think we're now in the midst of so many changes happening at the same time. That's the polycrisis and the convergence of uncertainties, that meeting the moment means having to think from the middle. Think from the middle, thinking from the middle of our times. In the midst of all this change, to ask new questions, seek new answers, embrace the uncertainty, and to do so in new intellectual and institutional forms. So, I think the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies is just made for a time like ours. So here's a toast to its future success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gluck. We have a few minutes now for questions about the talk, about the ideas that came out here. So I would like to open the floor to the audience. Do we have any questions? Comments?
No questions, comments? Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Yes, please. Do we have, I think you just have to raise your, oh, no, we have one.
Thank you very much, Professor Greg, and I really enjoyed your lecture and presentation. I have a question about your suggestion about the successful the research center, integrated research center. You mentioned about the organizing, maybe the last part of your suggestion, how you invite the senior researcher and the young researcher mix together and work together, and yeah, it is very challenging and very an ideal type of the collaboration, but it's in a practical sense, how can you organize this kind of a setting? Because in particular, Japanese university has probably in the Tokyo University has a very strict, maybe the distinction of the category of the professor and the associate professor and the students. So how do you dissolve or to break the barrier among these the researchers?
I told you that I'm not crazy, right? I'm just an optimist. Huh? Well, the way it works for us, and I'm based this mostly on experience, not on... The way it works for us is that these people, when they come to do a project or an event or anything with the Committee on Global Thought, they still are, senior professor so-and-so in their, in the business school, or they're the provost. We have the provost. They're the provost of the university. But when they're working on a project, so the project, it can be a project, a research project, it can be a series of symposia, but it's something that they're making together. When they come to work on one of these things in the Committee on Global Thought, they just come as Mr. Smith and Professor Jones. And they don't mind it because they don't lose. When they go back to their offices, then they're Senior Professor Smith again. So nobody is taking anything away from them. It has to do with their activities together in this third space. And it's been very successful. We've even had undergraduates working in research projects. They didn't start the research project. And the same works for our, by the way, for our international, our working with our 11 global centers. I mean, there are people from inside and outside the academy. I mean, there are journalists and NGO people and government people and business people. If you're working on one project together or one series of events or something, then status doesn't matter so much. And if it's a person for whom status matters so very much, he or she, there'll be no she's until you do some work here, but he won't stay there. He won't be part of it. They'll self-select out because it's voluntary. I mean, this is not an assignment. You don't have to teach this course or guide this student. It's not really as impossible as it sounds because it's in a third space. And what we found is that, much to our surprise, the most senior professors have been the most enthusiastic because they've spent their life in, the business school. And they don't ever get to talk about the latest, graphic novel or whatever. And they like to do that. So we haven't found, of course, no, we have hierarchy too, for heaven's sake, of course. Maybe you have more, but we have hierarchy. So the secret is the third space, project-based or events or simply sometimes conversations. And so far it's worked, and it's worked globally, because we, as I say, we work around the world. A lot of it is Zoom, these days, but so I would say try it before you worry about it not working, and let the people who don't take to it, show them the door and say thank you very much, and usher in the people who do rush into your open arms. You'll find them, and you'll find them not only among the younger people, certainly you'll find them among younger people, but you'll find them among senior people too, because it's intellectually very exciting to engage in something that you don't do every day with people who are really, exciting. That's what does it. It's magic. I mean, literally magic. And the magic happens between these different kinds of people, different ages and different disciplines and different, different views of the world. So I could encourage you.
Thank you. Can I just a small question? Yes. Sorry. My name is Hiroki Takakura. I'm an anthropologist and from the Center for Northeast Asian Studies. And I have a question on this. The question your talk. You mentioned about the Kyodo Kenkyu, not in Japanese. So, do you feel something different from the Kyodo Kenkyu Japanese and from the joint project in Western countries? And what if there is a difference? What is the suggestion for the development of this dissolution of hierarchy in university? I mean the collaboration among the many.
You got hierarchy on your mind. I can see that. The word just comes out naturally. Well, first of all, let me say that as an American, one of the things I liked best about Japanese academic life when I came into it was Kyodo Kenkyu, because we don't do that historically. We do individual work. All of our seniority and promotion and status depends on individual work. And in the sciences, natural sciences, where there are 5, 10 researchers, it's still the lead researcher who gets the most credit, even when the work is usually done by the other 9 people who are the junior people. So when I first came here, I was delighted by Kyodo Kenkyu. And because it meant that you were talking about an idea or a topic with other people, then you had your own, you had your own assignment. I actually was involved with something that's one step more than Kyodo Kenkyu, and that's Zentai Kenkyu. I don't know if you've ever been in one of those. That's the shaken at Todai. When you're a visiting researcher at shaken, at Shakai Kagaku Kenkyu, there is a 5-year project, and it's called Zentai Kenkyu. And I don't care who you are, or what you do for a living, or what your discipline is, you're in it. And that's a bit of a shock to an American. I mean, I was a professor by then. This wasn't a graduate student. It's a bit of a shock. I came to do my own research, and I was told, and what is your contribution to the topic of Zentai Kenkyu? which happened to be, believe it or not, in that 5 years, hope. Think about it, right? But the wonderful thing about Kyoto Kenkyu, or in that case Zentai Kenkyu, was how much we had to talk together to even understand how you could study something like hope if you were a political scientist or an agricultural economist or all kinds of specializations in the social sciences. And that was intellectually very invigorating and inspiring. So I'm a fan of Kyoto Kenkyu, but the distinction I was making is that this kind of collaboration is interdisciplinary. It's internally interdisciplinary. It's not just that the agricultural economist did his thing about hope, and I, as the modern historian, did my thing about hope. In these new projects, you have to understand each other's approach, so that before you can write, as you're researching and as you're thinking, you're already incorporating what agricultural economist has decided hope means in his field. So it's more interventionist, intrusive, internalized. You can think of it as an extension of what Japanese have traditionally done as Kyoto Kenkyu, but it's even more collaborative when it comes to the actual product that each person contributes, if that makes any sense. So for America, which doesn't do Kyoto Kenkyu in the humanities and social sciences very much, these kinds of projects are not traditional and I don't think a lot of people like them very much. I talked about them here pedagogically because it's absolutely fantastic for students. I didn't suggest that we do this. At the CGT, we do that among faculty and everyone, but that's not a recipe I would recommend to everyone. So that's the distinction. It was the individualized American research, which was so individual, the Kyoto Kenkyu of the traditional Japanese sort, which is great because it brings people together to study hope, and with a book series of, 8 volumes on hope when we were done, and then this more project-based experiential learning. Is that okay? I didn't mention hierarchy. Is that okay? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have 2 online questions for you, if that's okay. We're sort of tight on time here, but they've come in. The first one is from Sayaka Chatani. And
I know her. Hi-oh. Yes. Hello.
And she asks, what do you think of the emphasis on the lens of Asia to challenge West-dominated knowledge production? Are there any concrete ways for studies from Japan to alter or challenge US-centered academia?
Oh, yes. Sayaka, who wrote a wonderful book called The Nation Empire, I recommend it to you, who challenged national history in that book. Yes, of course. This whole thing is trying to do that. But it's not trying to do that. It's a little bit like the third space answer. It doesn't try to do that by challenging the West or Eurocentric views. It creates a different view, usually starting somewhere else. If you start with pick any question you like. I think of cooperative agriculture. I mean, there are lots of agricultural products around the world that require cooperation. Rice is only one of them, right? And if you want to look at what kind of social relations develop in villages in Latin America or in what kind of work social relations support this kind of cooperative seasonal agriculture, if you don't start with rice paddies and Japan, and if you start somewhere else and you ask the question about, not based on either Japan or the West, you completely vitiate the binary. Frankly, Sayaka, I really believe that spending our time resituating ourselves on the other side of the binary, Asia, is perpetuating the binary. It's basically letting the binary rule you. Get out of it. And there are lots of ways to get out of it. Starting somewhere else is one, but do you do the kind of global context work I'm talking about? And even in that Tesla example, it didn't turn out to be west-east or north-south in that case. Because when they were finished with it, it wasn't a north-south question. It was much more complicated than that. So I would say that first thing you do is forget the binary and say that the people who talked about east-west for 200 years are benighted, wrong, arrogant, imperialistic, and out of date. And ask your research questions about whatever topic you want to ask. But don't fight, don't let the other guy set the frame for you. That's what I mean about asking your own questions. Don't fight the binary by settling on the Asia side. Don't fight imperialism by settling on the colonial side. Set yourself in those countries and ask your questions. So you may not agree with that, but that's what I think. Thank you for the question.
All right, thank you very much. I'm afraid that brings us
Thank
to the
you.
end of our time
Thank you.
here.
Thank
so
you. Thank
one more
you.
time, I'd like to thank Professor Gluck.
Thank you.
Now we're going to have a 15-minute break before the second talk, and we have some refreshments out of the room, so please enjoy.
All right, I'd like to welcome you all once again to the second half of our program for today. I am pleased now to introduce our final speaker of the day, Professor Michael Burdash. He is the Robert S. Ingersoll Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. His work covers modern Japanese literature, modern Japanese culture, and intellectual history. He's also been prolific as a translator, and he's introduced works by writer Natsume Soseki and scholar Kame Hideo to English language audiences. His current research focuses on a reconsideration of Japanese cultures in the post-war and the Cold War periods. He joins us also in the coming year as a member of the advisory board for the Center of Integrated Japanese Studies. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Michael Burdash.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and it's a great honor to be here to help celebrate the establishment of the new Center for Integrated Japanese Studies. It's also a great honor to be here speaking with Carol Gluck, who's always been my model for what a scholar should be. And it's also a challenge to speak after Carol Gluck and try to match her eloquence and intelligence. I won't even try. I'm particularly delighted that all of this is happening here at Tohoku University, a school that's played an important role in my own life as a scholar and as a human being. I first set foot on this campus in 1984, 40 years ago, when I was an undergraduate studying at Miyagi University of Education up on Aobayama. And since that first visit to Sendai, I've been back here at Tohoku University on 3 different occasions as a visiting researcher or a visiting scholar. And I even married the daughter of a Tohoku University professor. So I'm married to this institution, and it's a delight to see the latest developments here. So I was asked to think about the history and the future of humanities-based Japanese studies scholarship. And as I thought about what I should talk about today at this event, I thought about my own history with this university and with this city. And I thought, well, I could start my talk looking back at 1984, the day I first came to Sendai. But I decided that it made more sense to start a little bit earlier than that, to start back in 1964, not 40 years ago, but 60 years ago. 1964 was also an important year for me personally. I was born in 1961, and my earliest memories are from 1964. I remember clearly going with my father in Stillwater, Minnesota in November 1964 to the election polling place where my father voted in the presidential election of 1964. So 1964 is as far back as I can remember as a human being. And so I thought I would today speak about what Japanese studies looked like around 1964, what it looks like today, 60 years later, and then speculate a little bit about what it might look like 60 years from now, in 2084. I'll be thinking primarily of Japanese studies in North America, which is only part of the story, but a crucial part. It's the part that I know best. And in some ways, I think it's appropriate since Japanese studies as an academic field was largely an American invention. It was part of the wave of area studies scholarship that emerged in the United States during the Cold War. It was distinct from the longer tradition of Oriental studies that had existed in European universities since the 19th century and even before that. Oriental studies tended to focus on philological studies of classical texts, whereas American post-war area studies focused primarily on modern cultures. Japanese studies in North America is also distinct from the way Japan had been studied at Japanese universities. Of course, for more than a century now, there have been university departments in Japan that focus on Japan. The Department of Japanese History, the Department of Japanese Literature, Japanese Language. Usually those departments had the character koku in their title, the Kokubungaku, the Kokushi department. But area studies, including Japanese studies as it emerged in the United States in the post-war period, was different from both the departments of national studies in Japan and the traditional Oriental studies departments in Europe. And 1964 is a good place to start thinking about this field of academic scholarship because it was around 1964 that major research universities in the United States started opening departments of East Asian studies and centers for Japanese studies. Of course, there are some schools such as Columbia, Harvard, Michigan that have a longer history in their departments, histories that date back before World War II. But that's unusual, exceptional, and in fact those older departments tended to follow the Oriental Studies model more than they followed sort of the post-war area studies program. So they're a little bit different from the field of Japanese studies. My own department of East Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago was established as the Department of Far Eastern Languages and Civilizations in 1963. That timing is more usual. It was from around about 1964 that it became common for North American universities to have a department where the scholars focused on producing new kinds of knowledge about geographical regions that were considered both important and understudied, and Japan was one of those regions. This was, of course, at the height of the Cold War. A time when the US government and private foundations were promoting the development of area studies as a new kind of academic specialty. Area studies were perceived as a key component in the ideological struggles of the Cold War era and an important tool in the project of building a liberal anti-communist global order. By 1964, the image of Japan as a liberal, democratic, free market ally of the United States had largely, but not completely, overwritten the older image of Japan as a wartime enemy from just 20 years earlier. In 1964, Japan was now a crucial ally of the United States in East Asia. And the United States government felt that Japan's culture had to be understood and appreciated. Moreover, after the Ampo protests in 1960 in particular, Japan was an ally whose status required cultivating and fostering. With the rise of communism in China and with the recent war in Korea and the rapidly expanding war in Vietnam, in 1964, the United States government and its allies were concerned about Japan, about knowing Japan, and about keeping Japan as a friendly ally. And Japan in particular was supposed to provide the model for a non-communist form of development or a non-communist form of modernization that the rest of Asia could learn from. So it was in this Cold War context that Japanese studies first emerged around 1964 in American universities and came to have an increasingly influential voice both inside academia and beyond. And sort of a telling instance of this was the appointment of a Japanese studies scholar, a Harvard University professor, as the US ambassador to Japan in 1961. Edwin Reischauer, so in 1964, the ambassador, the official representative of the United States, was a Japanese studies scholar from Harvard University. 1964 was also a year in which Japan was re-emerging on the world stage in new ways, and in which Japanese culture, particularly contemporary Japanese culture, was winning at an unprecedented degree of recognition abroad. I don't need to tell you that, of course, 1964 was the year of the Tokyo Olympics. 1964 was the year the Shinkansen service started in Japan. And around this time, modern and contemporary Japanese culture were being introduced in unprecedented ways to broad audiences in North America and Europe. In a sense, what today NHK and a few other people call cool Japan was actually starting to emerge around the world, although it wasn't called cool Japan in 1964. 1964 was, after all, just 1 year after Sakamoto Kyu's Sukiyaki was a worldwide hit in the United States and in Europe. And around that time, other Japanese popular performers like the Peanuts started appearing on American television and American radio. In literature as well, we see an increasing penetration of Japanese writing into North America and Europe. In 1964, Tanizaki Junichiro, we learned 50 years later, was shortlisted for the Nobel Prize in literature, and probably would have won it if he hadn't passed away in 1965. This was a sign of the acceptance that contemporary Japanese fiction was gaining in the English-speaking world. By 1964, we sort of had a big three group of modern Japanese writers who had been translated since the mid-1950s and became celebrated as the representatives, supposedly, of modern Japanese literature: Kawabata, Tanizaki, and Mishima. And so we have the emergence of a canon of modern Japanese literature in English translation around 1964. 1964 was also a turning point in the introduction of Japanese film to audiences outside Japan. Just as we had a big three in modern Japanese literature, there was also a big three in Japanese film. It started with Kurosawa Akira in 1951, when his film Rashomon caused a sensation around the world, and then he was quickly recognized as one of the world's great film directors. A few years later, Mizoguchi Kenji's works were discovered and started to be screened around the world from about 1954, 1955. Interestingly, it was not until 1963 that Ozu Yasujiro was widely introduced outside Japan. 5 of his films were screened at the 1963 Berlin Film Festival, and that created a sensation. And from about 1963-64, we started having scholarly articles introducing the important films of Ozu Yasujiro. So by around 1964, modern Japanese culture was achieving global recognition with both elite and popular audiences in America, Europe, and elsewhere. And it was right around this moment that American universities started commonly to employ scholars who would research and teach about Japanese culture to American students. So what did American Japanese studies look like around 1964? And I was asked specifically to speak about humanistic Japanese studies. And the first thing to say about Japanese studies in America around 1964 is that it was not particularly humanistic. There were, of course, scholars in the humanities who were involved, but the leadership of the field at that point was largely in the hand of social scientists, political scientists, economists, sociologists, historians, anthropologists. As Edward Said pointed out in his 1978 book, Orientalism, one of the primary differences between classical European Orientalism and post-war American area studies was the shift in focus away from classical literary philology to modern social science approaches. And Japanese studies reflected that shift as well. Where did the funding come from? In 1964, if you wanted to do research on Japanese studies topics, your funding largely came from the United States government. Or from private foundations that were closely allied to the United States government, like the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. The Japan-United States Educational Commission, now called Fulbright Japan, was established in 1952, and it was completely funded at that point by the United States government. And there was a rapid expansion in the sorts of fundings that were available around 1964. This graph gives you the number of Fulbright fellows involved in the exchange program with Japan. And as you can see, there's a rapid expansion starting about 1964 in the number of scholars that are being funded. We start with 24 in 1961-62. By 1966, 1967, we're up to 186. 30 of them from the US to Japan, 156 from Japan to the US. I have to mention that my future father-in-law was part of that cohort. He was a biologist from Tohoku University, sent to Harvard University as a Fulbright Fellow in that year to study. Those numbers are not all Japanese studies figures. This represents all disciplines, but I think those numbers give a portrait of the rapidly growing interest in Japanese, all things Japanese in American academia, and the kinds of funding that were available to support it. 1964 was also the first year that the Fulbright Hayes program started awarding the Doctoral Dissertation Research Abroad Grant and the Faculty Research Abroad Grant. Another program like the Fulbrights funded fully by the United States government. So in 1964, the funding came primarily from American governmental and private institutions closely linked to the American government, and that funding was expanding. It's probably worth mentioning that 1964 was the last year of the baby boom in the United States. And so the population of young people had been rapidly expanding and would continue to expand, which meant that budgets for education in general were expanding in the 1960s and 70s, and Japanese studies benefited from that. So looking specifically at humanistic Japanese studies research, what kinds of things were being studied, what kinds of things were being taught in 1964? If I had to pick a single word to describe what Japanese studies was doing in 1964, I think I would pick the word continuity. Of course, no single word can capture all of Japanese studies from this period, and of course there were some exceptions that do not fit this keyword. But in general, when I look at the research that was being produced in 1964, I think that we can describe a lot of it as having been a search for continuity. The dominant paradigm at that point, as Carol Gluck mentioned, was modernization theory. And under modernization theory, scholars looked for evidence of a cultural tradition that distinguished Japan from other countries and that provided a causal explanation for why Japan alone, among the countries of East Asia, had successfully modernized. There's a kind of paradox here, because the scholars looking at modernization theory were looking at a process of radical change. But in studying this process of rapid change, they tended to look for something that didn't change. They tended to look for some kind of continuity that connected the pre-modern to the modern era. They looked for a kind of stability in the form of a coherent cultural tradition that could change gradually without encountering radical upheaval or discontinuity. And it's important to note that this was the kind of story that the funding agencies in 1964 wanted to be told about Japan. They wanted a story about how Japan's cultural traditions helped explain Japan's success in the process of undergoing what was called modernization, a model that was different from the Marxist model, for instance, of revolution. So if we look at, if you took a class on Japanese religion in 1964, you almost certainly read this book, Robert Bella's classic 1957 study, Tokugawa Religions, the Values of Pre-Industrial Japan. When Robert Bella republished this book in 1982, he changed the subtitle. The subtitle was now The Cultural Roots of Modern Japan, which Bella said he thought reflected more accurately the contents of the book. And they do. What Bella is doing in the book is looking for pre-modern cultural roots of modern Japan. As he writes in the book, quote, Japan alone of the non-Western nations was able to take over very rapidly what it needed of Western culture in order to transform itself into a modern industrial nation. Students of Japan have come increasingly to feel that this success is not to be attributed to some mythical faculty of imitation, which the Japanese are supposed to possess, but to certain factors in the pre-modern period which prepared the ground for later developments. So, and Bello was specifically looking at the religious traditions of Edo period Japan and located in them what he described as a counterpart to the Protestant tradition which Max Weber had identified as the key to modernity in the West. In other words, Bello was looking to Edo period Japan for continuity in cultural elements that would persist and that would drive the process of modernization in Japan. So that's what you got if you took a religious studies class. If you took a literature class, you probably used these books. These were two pioneering anthologies of Japanese literature and translation, edited by Donald Keene, and he also translated most of the works that are included in these. And again, the point of these anthologies was to identify a cultural tradition that distinguished Japan and that formed a continuous thread that stretched from the Kojiki and the tales of Genji down through Mishima Yukio and Kawabata Yasunari. The story that Keene constructs in this and his scholarly writings from the time is of a great classical literature that flourished for centuries until it declined in the late Edo period and then was revived by the influence of modern Western literature starting in the Meiji period. So for Keene, modern Japanese literature was a successful hybrid that brought together classical literary traditions with Western modernity to create a new form. In 1964, a major collective research project was underway among Japanese studies scholars, the Studies in the Modernization of Japan series that resulted in the publication of several influential volumes. This was, as is well known, the result of a series of conferences that brought together scholars from Japan, the United States, and Europe to study the problem of modernization in Japan and come up with an explanation for it. For the most part, these scholars studied Japan in isolation and looked at how its cultural traditions persisted through time and helped, again, explain the question of how Japan alone among the countries of East Asia had managed to modernize. This was mostly social scientists involved in this project, but there was one volume that was dominated by the humanists that were involved in the project. Tradition and Modernization in Japanese Culture, published in 1971, was edited by Donald Shively, a specialist in literature and theater at the University of California, Berkeley. The volume brought together scholars from literature, art history, music, philosophy, linguistics, and religious studies. And as Shively in his editor's preface writes, he sums up the project's stance. Quote, on the surface, Japan appears to have turned away from her past traditions to follow Western models. But a close examination of the individual cases dealt with here reveals that the general product owed more than might be suspected to the quality of Japanese tradition. Again, what the project was looking for was a tradition of cultural, a cultural tradition that was continuous across the pre-modern and the modern period. So those are the sorts of things that are being studied and taught. What's not being taught? Popular culture was not being taught in 1964. We already had the beginnings of serious scholarship on Japanese film and Japanese music in 1959, but those topics were not being taught for the most part at American universities in 1964. This is because film studies and ethnomusicology, in particular ethnomusicology focusing on commercial popular music, wouldn't emerge as fields of academic study until later, the 1970s and the 1980s. So even though popular audiences in 1964, as we've already seen, were being exposed to popular media culture from Japan, you could not in 1964 go to an American university and major in these. You couldn't study these at an American university. There's one last thing I would like to look at in thinking about 1964 humanistic Japanese studies, and that's to ask the question of what did humanistic mean in terms of humanistic studies in 1964. How is humanistic scholarship different from social science scholarship, natural science scholarship, and other disciplines? And so, being a good literary scholar, I went to the dictionary, the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and looked up the word humanities. And of course, one of the definitions of the humanities is a collection of certain disciplines and objects of study that we traditionally call the humanities: literature, art, history, religion, et cetera, et cetera. But to call scholarship humanistic implies something more than just a certain range of disciplines and a certain range of objects of studies. The word humanities is closely related to the word humanism. And the word humanism, if we look up again in the dictionary, again Merriam-Webster, I found the third definition that was given seemed particularly relevant to thinking about humanistic research was or should be. The third definition on the slide describes humanism as a doctrine, attitude, or way of life centered on human interests or values. And as this suggests, I think humanistic research implies a certain stance towards scholarship, a certain way of posing questions and of answering questions, and a focus on specific kinds of questions and specific kinds of answers, those, quote, centered on human interests or values. Humanistic scholarship, including humanistic Japanese studies, is often concerned with questions of value and questions of judgment, questions that cannot be answered objectively. In 1964, many social scientists were trying to achieve what they called a value-free or an objective mode of scholarship. But our tendency as humanistic scholars, when somebody comes up and says, I'm doing value-free scholarship, is to immediately say, no, that's not value-free scholarship. You've hidden your values. You've simply concealed the values that are implicit in your project, and the proper thing to do is to bring the values forward and explicitly define. So we like to point out in the humanities that attempts to claim objectivity are usually built on an unacknowledged foundation of value judgments that simply haven't been acknowledged in the research. And it's hard to imagine what a value-free humanities scholarship might look like. Humanities scholarship, in my view, is scholarship that deals intrinsically with judgments and values, defending and defining values that are often under threat from the economic power and power structures of society. Ethical values, moral values, spiritual values, aesthetic values, intellectual values. Directly or indirectly, humanities scholarship is almost always involved in making value judgments. We say that this piece of writing is more important than that piece of writing. This painting is more beautiful or more sophisticated than that painting. This action is more ethical than that action. This text is more interesting than that text. This poem is more meaningful than that one. Moreover, as we make these kinds of value judgments, which are always challenged and always should be challenged, we're also debating the values that are inherent and that are or should be used in making these kinds of judgments. We're always trying to define the values that we employ, and we're always trying to figure out what values we should be using in thinking about humanistic work and what values are crucial to shaping our experience as humans. So humanistic scholarship is in many ways a never-ending conversation about the importance of values in human existence and about what those values are and what those values should be. Humanistic scholarship is where we debate and study the values that are fundamental to human life, including the defense of values that are oftentimes in conflict with other values that are dominant in a society, values that rule, for instance, in the realms of the economic or the realms of the political. So what were the values that were at stake in 1964 Japanese studies? And I think, there are many ways you can answer this question, but I think that there were three main sets of values that were driving the scholars in that period that they thought were crucial and that they wanted to defend in their scholarship. I think anti-racism was one of them, that they were pursuing a liberal model of integration and inclusion. I think the value of liberty and freedom was crucial to them, often defined as anti-communism. And I think that questions of aesthetic and intellectual value were also crucial to the scholars in 1964, often defined in terms of questions of universalism. What are universal values in intellectual and aesthetic life? So the goal in 1964 was to bring Japan back into the family of nations after the disaster of World War II and in response to the needs of the Cold War. This project involves an insistence on the need to respect cultural difference, an insistence that Japanese culture had value that was different from cultures in other places, but that was just as important and just as valuable as cultures elsewhere. This involved an insistence also that the cultural difference of Japan was precisely that, the product of a continuous cultural tradition, not a biological product. Japanese studies was an important component in the post-war period in the effort to reject biological explanations for culture, to reject biological models of race that claimed that some groups of humans were biologically inferior to others. This involved integrating the particulars of Japanese cultural difference into categories that were thought to be universal to human existence. Those values included notions of freedom as a universal good, and this project involved demonstrating that Japanese culture, including Japanese literature, art, religion, and philosophy, were not simply of particular interest to people who were interested in Japan, but that in fact they were of universal interest to anyone who was interested in questions of literature, art, philosophy, etc., etc. There was also an insistence that these were primarily cultural values. That what held Japan together was not an economic structure or a class structure or a political structure, but a shared set of cultural traditions and values that persisted through time. Now, from the perspective of 2024, it's pretty easy to spot some of the problems with these values that were, I think, driving scholarship in 1964. There are many things we could point to. Let me just quickly point out a few of the things that seem obvious to us. First of all, the way freedom was defined and linked to a strong anti-communist stance caused many scholars in the field to think of the ongoing decolonization struggles that were taking place in East Asia and places like Vietnam as a threat to freedom, as opposed to being maybe an instance of freedom. Second, it's kind of obvious from our stance that in the attempt to replace biological notions of race with cultural explanations, Japanese studies too often ended up simply reproducing the same categories that had existed under racist explanations, but giving them a culturalist explanation. So that, if the new cultural explanations for Japanese patterns of life and thought looked exactly the same as the old biological explanations, had anything really changed? In the switch. So despite its anti-racist stance, humanistic Japanese studies in 1964 too often reproduced models of Japanese culture that were hard to distinguish from the earlier racially based models that it was trying to replace. And thirdly, the strong desire to identify a continuous Japanese cultural tradition that defined Japanese cultural difference ended up leading to a distorted narrative of Japanese history. For example, the experience of the 1930s and the 1940s, the impact of fascism and imperialism and militarism were downplayed in most narratives being produced at the time as a kind of aberration or a kind of deviation that really didn't belong to the core of Japanese cultural tradition. It's also important to note that these tendencies were related closely to the structure of funding that kept Japanese studies alive in 1964. This kind of knowledge about Japan was consistent with what the funding sources wanted. In humanistic scholarship, as in every kind of scholarship, it's always crucial to follow the money and to ask who's paying for the research and why. What do they want from the research? And to think about the research we're doing in relationship to those issues. We always need to think about what sorts of values the funders of scholarship are promoting and whether those are the same values that we should be defending. So let me jump ahead now to 2024 today. and think about what humanistic Japanese studies looks like today in comparison with 1964. By coincidence, 2024 marks also the 50th anniversary of the Journal of Japanese Studies, one of the important scholarly journals that has helped define the field. But if you accept my thesis that Japanese studies really got underway around 1964 rather than 1974, then 2024 marks not the 50th anniversary, but the 60th anniversary, or the Kanneki, the Kanneki birthday of Japanese studies. And the Kanneki is always a good time to look back on what has been accomplished across a life, what hasn't been accomplished, and to reflect on what has been done. And so this is a good time to look back on 1964. And of course, over the past 60 years, many things have changed dramatically. The historical context in which Japanese studies works has shifted dramatically. The Cold War ended in the early 1990s. The Japanese economic bubble ended around the same time. The economic, cultural, and political structure of East Asia has changed dramatically since 1964. Whereas 1964 Japanese studies was very much a product of the Cold War world, 2024 Japanese studies is a product of the post-Cold War world, and we're all still trying to figure out what exactly that is supposed to look like. So where do things stand in 2024? In 1964, we saw that there was a boom in the popular reception of Japanese film, literature, and music. What's the situation in 2024? As I spoke about a few minutes ago, 1964 was kind of the peak of a golden era of translation of modern Japanese literature into English. And today, in 2024, we seem to be back in another golden era of translation of contemporary Japanese literature into English. In particular, in the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen a boom in English translations of writings by female authors from Japan. These translations are reviewed in the most prestigious magazines and newspapers. They oftentimes win major book awards in the United States or in the UK. So we're in another moment when contemporary Japanese literature is sort of exploding on the scene. I mentioned that in 1964, Tanizaki Junichiro was rumored to be a strong candidate for the Nobel Prize in Literature. Today we talk about Tawada Yoko as possibly the next Japanese Nobel Prize winner. If there's some Murakami Haruki fans here, I apologize for not putting him in that category. In 1964, as I mentioned, Japanese cinema was establishing itself as a major world cinema, and of course today, Japanese films and film directors continue to win major awards at film festivals, continue to be distributed around the world and to influence filmmakers and critics everywhere. And of course, with the rise of the internet and global platforms like Netflix and YouTube and Spotify, Japanese popular culture in its media forms have penetrated global audiences in a way that we've never seen before. The students who come to our Japanese studies classes at American universities in 2024 have been raised since childhood on Pokemon, Studio Ghibli, and other Japanese anime, video games, and manga as part of their everyday life. So compared to 1964, in 2024, Japanese popular culture has in many ways shifted from the position of an exotic foreignness that's interesting to the position of an everyday companion for young people in their daily lives, though I don't think questions of exoticism and Orientalism have disappeared. So turning to Japanese studies scholarship, what does it look like in 2024? Area studies today, including Japanese studies, is now largely dominated by scholars from the humanities and from the humanistic social sciences, fields like history and anthropology. Compared to 1964, there are relatively few scholars in the hard social sciences, like political science, sociology, and economics, who would identify themselves as Japanese studies scholars. So there's been a shift in what part of the university seems to be doing the most work in Japanese studies. One thing that hasn't changed since the 1960s, North American universities still offer classes in Japanese literature, both modern and pre-modern. They still offer classes in Japanese art history, Japanese religious studies, Japanese history, just like they did in 1964. But today, almost every North American university also offers classes in Japanese popular culture. Film, anime, manga, popular music, games, television. Sometimes those classes classes are taught by literature scholars, people like me. Sometimes they're taught by faculty in history or anthropology or linguistics. But we also have scholars today teaching in universities who specialize in Japanese film, who specialize in Japanese popular music. Unlike 1964, today you can go to an American university and specialize in the study of Japanese film, or specialize in the study of Japanese popular music. Those are now recognized academic disciplines, and Japanese studies played an important role in their emergence as recognized academic disciplines. The publication, for instance, of Anderson and Ritchie's book in 1959 was followed in the 1960s and 70s with the publication of a number of influential works of scholarship and criticism focused on Japanese film. And then in the 1970s, Japanese film really took off as an academic specialization. People started earning PhDs in Japanese film in the 1970s. And in the 1980s, universities started hiring those PhDs to teach specialized courses in Japanese film. So since the 1980s, it's been very common for American and European universities to have classes on Japanese film taught by scholars who are specialists in Japanese film. As Mitsuhiro Yoshimoto points out in his book, Kurosawa, Film Studies and Japanese Cinema, the discovery of Kurosawa and Mizoguchi and Ozu in the 1950s and 60s was crucial to this change in the structure of the university. The discovery of Japanese film as an important non-European, non-American form of film that was worthy of scholarship, worthy of being taught, created the impression that film was an important academic study that should have its own discipline. It was the discovery of Japanese film sort of made film studies a universal discipline and was crucial in establishing that part of the university. Something similar happened in the academic study of Japanese popular music as a form of humanistic scholarship. Since about 2000, we've seen a wave of new scholarly studies in English of Japanese popular music, and in the last 5 to 10 years, we're now seeing more and more courses being offered on Japanese popular music at American universities. So one of the big changes in humanistic Japanese studies since 1964 is the emergence of scholarship and teaching focused on popular commercial media forms like film and music, as well as other related fields. Another major change since 1964 is the source of funding. As I said, in 1964, almost all the funding came from the US government or from foundations closely linked to the American government, and they had their own priorities for funding decisions. Today, the source of funding has largely shifted. There's, of course, still funding coming from US sources, but much more comes from the Japanese government. And from Japan-based foundations and from the private sector in Japan. In 1993, when I came to Tohoku University to do the research for my doctoral dissertation, I applied to the Fulbright and the Fulbright-Hays programs, just like a scholar would have done in 1964. But I also applied to the Japan Foundation and to the Japanese Ministry of Education. That was new. And in 2000-2001, when I came here as a visiting scholar for a year, my research was funded by the Japan Foundation. So I'm a beneficiary of this shift in the funding sources of Japan. Moreover, starting in 1979, the Japanese government began to share the cost of the Fulbright program, so it was no longer a fully US government-funded operation. So we have a new set of funding sources today that is different from the set of funding sources that existed in 1964, which of course means we have a new set of priorities and ideological missions that are shaping Japanese studies from the inside and the outside. And if popular culture has emerged as being more central to Japanese studies in recent years, that's probably, at least in part, because the funding sources want that to be the case. Moreover, whereas in 1964, the sources of funding for research on Japanese studies scholarship were rapidly expanding, today it feels like they're stagnant and maybe even shrinking. With a shrinking population of students in both the United States and Japan, educational budgets in general are under a lot of pressures, unlike the case in 1964. And so educational budgets in general are being cut everywhere. So we're in a very different funding environment from what our predecessors were in 1964. Another change that's happened since 1964, whereas at that time Japanese studies was a field that existed primarily in North American and a few European universities, today it's a field in which Japanese universities have taken an increasingly central role. Today, many Japanese universities have programs in Japanese studies, and they play a central role in the way the field is developing globally. And of course, we're here today to celebrate the launching of another important center for Japanese studies. We see similar developments in Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, China. There are programs of Japanese studies all across East Asia today in a way that wasn't true in 1964. We have the emergence of English language and multilingual journals taking up Japanese studies and East Asian studies, being produced by and published by scholars located in East Asia. So in 2024, Japanese studies is no longer a field in which American and European scholars talk to other Americans and Europeans about Japan. Today, in 2024, Japanese studies is a field in which scholars from many places, including Japan, talk about Japan with scholars from many other places. The geographical dispersion and hierarchies of the field have shifted dramatically since 1964. So what kinds of humanistic Japanese studies, research, and teaching are taking place today? In 2024, particularly in comparison to what was the case in 1964. Of course, the objects of study and teaching have shifted considerably. We still find classes and research publications dealing with the traditional subjects of literature, art history, religion, history, etc. But as I've said, we also have a new range of classes and scholarship dealing with new popular culture forms, media studies forms. We also have the rise of digital humanities, which brings a new range of powerful methodologies that enable us in the humanities to handle data on a scale that was previously impossible. No single human being could read, for instance, 10,000 Japanese novels and analyze them. That's just beyond the capacity of a human being. But a machine can read 10,000 novels and analyze them and look for patterns and look for deviations of the patterns. So we're becoming able now with digital humanities tools to do scholarship on a scale much greater than what was able to be imagined in 1964. So are there any shared tendencies across the scholarship that's emerged and that is emerging in 2024? What are the values that are central to humanistic Japanese studies in 2024? I use the word continuity to describe the tendency of Japanese studies in 1964, and if I had to come up with a single word to describe the shared tendency of Japanese studies research in the humanities in 2024, I think I would choose the word circulation. Whereas Japanese studies scholars in 1964 were interested in identifying cultural traditions that seemed to distinguish Japanese culture from other cultures and that linked the long history of Japan into a single continuous story that unfolded across time. In 24, Japanese studies scholars seem more interested in looking at how cultural forms we associate with Japan are products of circulation through transnational networks. Instead of looking for continuous threads across time, today we tend to look for connections and movements across space. And I think this is connected to what Carol Gluck was talking about when she called for us to place Japan in global context. I think that that's one of the shared tendencies in the field today. The goal is not so much to find what distinguishes Japanese culture from other cultures, but rather to see how Japan functions as one node in wider trans-regional and global networks. People, objects, and ideas flow across oceans and borders, and what we understand as Japanese culture is produced by that movement, by those flows. So let me introduce 4 recent books that I think that will help me explain what I mean by circulation. I could have picked a lot of books, and I started out with a list of about 20, so you'll be thankful that I got it down to about 4 to present. But I think that they are representative and help us get a sense of what kinds of issues and values are central today. I first want to talk about David Novak's book, Japanoise, Music on the Edge of Circulation, which was published in 2013. He's an associate professor of music at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And he tells a story. Back in the 1980s and the 1990s, a small group of people in the Kansai region began experimenting with different ways to make experimental noise. They were interested in what happens when you connect machines up to amplifiers and feed the sound back through the amplifiers, producing an enormously loud and obnoxious sound. What kinds of music could we make through this kind of feedback? These performers didn't think of themselves as doing something particularly Japanese. They didn't think of themselves as being connected to Japanese culture or cultural traditions. But when the recordings that they made crossed the Pacific Ocean and reached people in North America who were interested in similar kinds of experimental music, the sounds they were produced were identified by that new audience on the other side of the Pacific as being Japanese noise, or Japanoise. A new musical genre emerged, Japanoise was the name given to a kind of experimental noise that was defined and linked to Japanese culture. And then this new way of thinking about these recordings crossed back over the Pacific to Japan. And music critics and music stores and record companies and musicians in Japan started to think that they were playing this genre, Japanoise, or Japanese noise. In other words, it was through the process of traveling, of circulating, that a new value was produced. The sounds became specifically Japanese noise as a result of this process of circulation and cultural feedback. So circulation itself produced cultural value. It produced the value of being Japanese. The noise didn't start out as Japanese noise. It only became Japanese noise through the process of traveling from one place to another and then back again. And Novak shows us how the process of circulation is in this way always producing something new. It's always producing something extra, something that wasn't there at the start of the process. And I think this provides a useful model for understanding how circulation works in many of the instances of contemporary Japanese scholarship that I've been thinking about. Another book I'd like to introduce is by Danica Gabrakova. It's called The Unnameable Archipelago, Insular Readings in Japanese Post-War Literature and Thought. It was published in 2018. She's a senior lecturer in the Japanese School of Languages and Cultures at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. And she received her PhD at the University of Tokyo, so she's an instance of the ways that Japanese studies is no longer exclusively centered in North American or European institutions. So in her book, she takes up the notion of an archipelago as a kind of metaphor for a way of being in the world, one that connects Japan and Japanese culture to other archipelagos across the world, the Caribbean, the Micronesia, and various others. Japan as an archipelago is part of a network of archipelagos and of a certain way of thinking and existing that is generated by living in an archipelago. She looks at writers like Shimao Toshio, Oba Minako, and Ariyoshi Sawako as instances of what she calls archipelago culture. According to Gabrakova, an archipelago generates a hybrid way of existing that is inherently open to the world, one in which boundaries are always porous, and one that deviates from sort of standard or conventional ways of thinking about self-identity or sovereignty. She provides us a different model for thinking about Japan. A way of thinking about Japanese culture is something that is not homogenous, something that is not monolithic, something that is not closed. In Gabrakova's view, Japanese culture itself is a kind of open-ended circulation. William Bridges' book, Play in the Shadows, Fictions of Race and Blackness in Post-War Japanese Literature, was published in 2020. He's an associate professor of modern languages and cultures at the University of Rochester. And he, as he says in the quote, is interested in attempting to read post-war Japanese fiction as a kind of black literature. He looks at post-war Japanese literature in terms of an idea or rhetoric of blackness that circulates between Japan and the rest of the world in the years after 1945. He's not interested in whether the representations of blackness that were produced by Japanese writers are accurate or mistaken. Instead, he's interested in what they create, what they generate through invoking blackness in their writings? What kinds of alliances and connections do Japanese writers produce when the idea of blackness circulates to Japan and is adopted by Japanese writers? What new values are produced when the idea of blackness circulates through Japan? He looks at writers like Oe Kenzaburo, Nakagami Kenji, and Yamada Amy, among many others. And starting from the idea that race is a fictional construct, Bridges explores how Japanese writers reconstruct the fictions of race into new modes as they engage in dialogue, direct and indirect, with others around the world. And I think he provides us with yet another model for thinking about how Japanese culture and literature are produced through a process of circulation. Finally, let me mention Edward Mack's book, Acquired Alterity, Migration, Identity, and Literary Nationalism. This was published in 2022. He is a professor of Asian languages and literatures at the University of Washington. And in this study, what circulates is Japanese literature itself. Mack is interested in studying Japanese language fiction that appears in Brazil, in newspapers and magazines that were published for immigrants from Japan. He looks both at texts that were written by authors living in Japan and texts that were written by authors living in Brazil. And what's produced through circulation in this instance, according to Mack, is what he calls acquired alterity. The difference that interests the writers of this literature in Brazil is not the difference between Japanese and non-Japanese, but rather the kinds of difference that open up among people who are supposed to be the same. Mack's approach resembles what in recent years has been called Nihongo Bungaku, or Japanese language literature in Japanese literary studies. But Mack doesn't think that that concept is adequate to describe what he's finding in these texts. He argues that the distinction that's drawn in Nihongo Bungaku studies between Nihon Bungaku and Nihongo Bungaku, or between Japanese literature and Japanese language literature, is built on a false distinction. It builds a distinction between those who are accidentally Japanese and those who are organically Japanese. And that this erases the reality that all identities are produced through the accidents of history, that all identities acquire alterity. They are all characterized by heterogeneity. Identity is always a kind of fiction that's full of tensions and contradictions, whether one is speaking Japanese in Japan or in Brazil. So it's another model for thinking about how circulation is central to the production of Japanese culture. Again, I could have introduced many other works, but these four, I think, give a little snapshot of how I think this notion of circulation is becoming dominant in Japanese studies in the humanities in the year 2024. And so having done all of that, I can't resist the urge to speculate about what humanistic research in Japanese studies might look in the year 2084. I started with the year 1964, the year of my first memory, the presidential election of 1964. And then I compared it to 2024. And of course, it turns out there's a presidential election this year. This year it will be not my father, but me going to the polling place to vote. I will do so with an enormous sense of anxiety about the future. And when I started thinking about 2084, I realized that, guess what? There's an American presidential election scheduled in the year 2084. I imagine somewhere there's a computer in Washington, D.C. that's already like crunching data, trying to figure out who's going to be voting in 2084 and what can be done. One thing that I know for sure about the 2084 election is that I will not be voting in it. And that, for me, is the great advantage for speaking today about humanistic Japanese studies in the year 2084. No matter what I say, I'm not going to be around in 60 years to have to take responsibility for it. So I can be a little bit free and irresponsible in what I say. So what will humanistic Japanese studies look like in 2024? What books will be written? What disciplines will be dominant? And the first thing to say is that, of course, we have no guarantee that there will be something called Japanese studies or Japan or humanities or universities in 2084. There is a significant chance that with global warming and industrial pollution and other human-generated problems, that the human world and the cultural formations that we know today will no longer exist, or that humans existing in 2084 might be living under conditions that do not permit the luxury of things like pursuing Japanese studies or going to universities. And part of our responsibility as scholars today is to try to make sure that that doesn't happen, to try to construct a livable future for our species and for our planet. But if we assume that something like the universities that we know today still exist in 2084, and if we assume that something like Japanese studies is still being taught there, what will it look like? Will it be dominated by the humanities or by the social sciences? And I suspect it will end up linking up more than we do today with other parts of the university. For instance, the natural sciences, engineering, medicine. And I think that the plan for the new Center for Integrated Japanese Studies at this moment is looking precisely in that direction. I think that digital humanities as methodologies are also moving us in that direction, as are other new modes of scholarship that combine, for example, the study of literature with the study of environmental studies, or models that combine the study of philosophy and ethics with the study of medicine. The kind of interdisciplinary work that Carol Gluck was talking about in her talk earlier. So let's be optimistic and assume that our species survives until 2084 and that people have the luxury to think about things like culture and to study at places like at universities. What will it look like? I think it's a good bet that people will still be making up stories and still be enjoying looking for ways to combine the sounds of words into patterns that sound good to their ears. People will still be finding pleasing and unusual ways to combine colors and lines and sounds to produce beautiful effects. Moreover, as people do these things, people will still continue looking back over earlier writings and earlier paintings and earlier forms of music for inspiration. People will still be looking back at the tale of Genji. People will still be trying to write poems in 5/7/5 patterns. I think that's very likely. The Japanese language will still exist and still be spoken and read, but it might have more machine speakers than human speakers in 2084. Of course, there will always be shifts in the specific works that are at the focus of the attention of scholarship and of the culture. Some writers that we think today are crucial will probably fade away. Some figures that we think are completely unimportant will have emerged as being really central. Back in 1907, Natsume Soseki wrote that someday William Shakespeare might be forgotten. And the same thing is true of Natsume Soseki. Someday Natsume Soseki might be forgotten. The works that people read will likely change, but I think that education and scholarship in 2084 will still be focused on trying to understand better how those works are put together and how they create or challenge the values by which we try to live our lives. If 1964 Japanese studies was unified around the notion of continuity and 2024 Japanese studies was unified by an interest in the problem of circulation, what will the key word in 2084 humanistic Japanese studies be? And I suspect that it might revolve around rethinking what we mean by the words human and humanistic. The concept of humanism too often defines human in problematic ways. It presumes that some people are more human than others, and the concept also seems to privilege humans over other species. So if I had to guess what might be for humanistic Japanese studies in 2084 a key word, I think it might be something like being with. I think it will likely involve rethinking the idea of humanistic in terms of being with non-humans. To be human is to be fundamentally related to non-humans. These include other species, viruses, machines, radioactive isotopes, climates, ecologies, ecosystems, planets. And we already see attempts in recent scholarship to rethink the concept of humanism and to decenter the position of the human in our understanding of the world. In fields like eco-criticism and the studies of the Anthropocene, today's scholars are trying to rethink the humanities so that we can see more clearly how humans are only one part of the ecologies that exist on Earth, and that we have an ethical responsibility not only to other humans, but to other species. And to systems around us, and that our responsibilities to them is a fundamental part of what it means to be human. In sum, I suspect that in 2084, scholars will be working toward a new way of understanding what it means to be human and what values that this implies. Where will the funding come from in 2084? I have no idea. But I suspect things will have changed pretty dramatically. I think that the current model for funding universities and scholarship in North America, Europe, and Japan is largely broken. I hope that by 2084, a different and more productive model will have emerged. Whatever that model is, whoever is providing the funding, I think we will, though, still see tension between the values being promoted by funding sources and the values that are important to humanistic scholars. I doubt that tension will ever go away, because one of the most important tasks of humanistic scholarship is to defend important values that are being ignored elsewhere. I can't tell you what sort of books are going to be published in 2084. I can't tell you what concepts they're going to use. I can't tell you what methods they're going to rely on. And I don't think any specific predictions that I made would be very useful. But I think we can think about humanistic Japanese studies in 2084 in one very useful way. We can think about 2084 as an imaginary point in the future that's looking back at us in 2024, just as we today look back on 1964. I hope that the Tohoku University Center for Integrated Japanese Studies has a long and productive existence. And perhaps in 2084, they will organize a conference to celebrate their 60th anniversary, their Konneki. And if they do, what will they say when they look back at us in 2024? Just as it's very easy for us in 2024 to look back at our predecessors in 1964 and see their blind spots and see their failings as well as their accomplishments, our successors in 2084 will be able to see things about us that we ourselves cannot see. Will they see that we were defending the values we should have been defending? Or will they see problems in our definition of those values? Will they see that we were compromising our scholarship to meet the ideological agendas of funding agencies and other powerful agencies in society? So I think keeping 2084 in mind as we carry out our scholarship into 2024 can provide us with a measure of humility as well as a sense of responsibility. Our scholarship today has a responsibility to our predecessors from 1964. We have a responsibility, of course, to our contemporaries today in 2024, but we also have a responsibility to those who will follow us. They will judge what we have accomplished or failed to accomplish using standards and values that will likely be very different from our own standards and values. So we have work to do in 2024. And as we do it, I think we should keep in mind that 2084 is already looking at us, judging us at how well we have carried out that work. So I look forward to seeing the accomplishments of the new Tohoku University Center for Integrated Japanese Studies as part of this work. I congratulate Tohoku University on this wonderful development and occasion, and let's get to work. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I would like now, again, to open the floor to questions, and I forgot to mention this last time, but you are welcome to ask questions in English or in Japanese, as is most comfortable for you. So let's have any questions or comments. Also, the online people. I will note that I will have to live to be 109 years old to be at the 60th anniversary. I'm not sure if I want to do that or not, but there you go. Yes, please.
That was fabulous. Now I'm going to ask you, maybe because of what I was thinking about before, do you see signs now of kyozon, of being with, already gestating in Japanese studies? You mentioned a few fields. Can we see the future now in some of these ways, particularly the being with?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think we very much already see movements in this direction. I think there's been a recent wave, for instance, in eco-criticism in modern Japanese literature studies, thinking about how literature is one of the places where we come to understand and imagine our relationship to the environment in which we live, and imagine our impact on that environment. I think we see it there. I think in the studies of Minamata-byo and the literature and culture that has come out of there is a model for thinking about what it means to live with industrial pollution and the impacts on the environment of human economic activity. I think in the field of ethics, I think that there's both in Japan and the United States, there's an attempt to use ethical studies to think about fundamental issues in medicine and how we work in medicine, like the issue of consent. What does it mean to give consent, informed consent for a medical procedure, is a fundamental ethical question and I think that works like Japanese philosophy and Japanese literature have a lot to tell us about that. So I think we do see, and in some ways, it's already happening now. Whether what we're doing now will be continuous for 60 years or not is another question, but I think that this is already happening today, and that some of the best scholarship is certainly working with that. We also have thing theory, a new wave of scholarship, trying to think about how we live with material objects and what is the nature of our relationships with them as a fundamental question of what it means to be human.
Thank you very much. We still have a little time for questions. Okay, at the back there.
Thank you for the beautiful time. Obviously, I mean, you obviously mentioned internet, but I mean, if you're going, like if we compare now with like 60 years ago, and even if we try to like do like science fiction, like humanities science fiction in 60 years, the great discontinuity, and in a certain within the continuity of we're still working mostly with texts in humanities. Like of course, I mean, people do like field work and so on, but like for a lot of work is still based on text. But the access and the production and the dissemination. It's the availability of older things and the and of newer stuff, like the amount of like digital only publications, what's immediately accessible from any given point at any given moment, there's an overload. So it seems, and obviously, I mean, it's both opportunities and dangers in a way. Like my impression is that people that were working on even not 60 years ago, but even 20 years ago, they knew what to read. So that it was about a certain kind of work, like an engagement with sources, and now a great part of somebody who's doing research in humanities selecting sources, out of the whole mass of what's available. And this kind of you were mentioning that how more horizontal media consumption, culture access is becoming. So probably that's something that's going to be even more extreme in the future. And what kind of, I would say, opportunities and dangers are really mixed here. What's your take?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of problems mentioned that in there. I mean, so we have the overwhelming flood of availability of texts and other kinds of information that are available to us, which makes us less and less able to negotiate and navigate what's out there. But we also have the problem of obsolescence of online tools, so that things that were published online 15 years ago are no longer accessible because of the way the technologies have moved on. I think as you said, I mean, I would agree with you that there are both opportunities and dangers. I think we're very much in the early stages of developing the kinds of scholarly tools that will be needed to deal with that scale of available archive, as sort of an infinite archive. So there are two, at the same time as this problem is emerging and increasingly difficult, there are also new kinds of weapons or new kinds of tools that are becoming available to us to deal with those. Those tools are shaping our scholarship in certain ways. They have, said to echo language from my talk, they come with certain values loaded into them that cause them to organize information in certain ways and not in other ways. So even as we are using these new tools, they're using us in certain ways. I think you're absolutely right. It's a time of opportunity and also potential peril. The questions of archiving, how do we archive at that volume, at that level, when, what is the YouTube videos every minute, I can't remember how many hundreds of years of video are uploaded every minute to YouTube, where the problem is infinitely expanding and exploding. I think that it also calls into questions to what extent are these what segment of that flood of information is Japanese or could be connected to Japan? What makes a text Japanese? And as I was writing this, I was thinking about as we are moving into ChatGPT getting better and better and writing novels and writing poems, which I think in 10 years we will not be able to tell the difference, maybe not 10 years, maybe a lot sooner than that. Luckily, we can still tell the difference when our undergraduates hand in something written by ChatGPT. At this level, we can still sort of detect it. We won't be able to in 10 years. They'll start generating text in Japanese. And Japanese novels that quote from the tradition of Japanese literature. The devices producing those will be located in various places around the world. How do we fit those into the categories that we have? I don't know. These are both dangers and opportunities that await. I think there's enough of a Marxist in me to note that any new mode of production also produces its own, the thing that's going to destroy it, that's going to overthrow it. And I think that's true here. We may not know what it is that the new tools are doing, which is going to prove to be their overcoming, but it's there, and the people that come after us will find it.
Thank you very much. Our next question comes from online viewer. This is Tohoku University's own James Tink, and he asks, how might the humanities, and especially literary studies, as you mentioned in your 4 examples, circulate with other academic disciplines at a pedagogical level? And he notes that you may have already answered this in your replies already.
Yeah. That's a great question. I think Carol Gluck in her presentation today gave us some really wonderful models for doing that. Putting literary scholars in a room together with people that work on very different things and asking them to come up with new questions and think about how each of them might address that question. I think the tools that we have as literary scholars, can engage in productive dialogues with scholars from across the campus. And we, of course, have enormous things to learn from scholars working in departments like medicine and engineering and the natural sciences. And I think I would say it's and this doesn't sound like a University of Chicago person speaking here, but I think it's a problem that has to be solved in practice rather than in theory. Usually in the University of Chicago, we start by solving in theory and then don't care too much about practice. But I think the pedagogical tools will be worked out through experiments, some of which are going to work and some of which aren't going to work. They have to be carried out in a certain kind of environment, what Carol Gluck called a third space, a place that allows people to open up in ways that they can't open up in their home institutions or in their usual home departments, which is why something like the Center for Integrated Japanese Studies has a lot of potential for creating those kinds of cross-disciplinary connections that could be very useful in pedagogy.
All right, thank you very much. One more time, I ask everybody to offer a thanks to Professor Burdash for his talk. And with that, we will move towards our, what would we say, conclusionary remarks. which I will make, yes. So, I would like to thank, first of all, everyone who gathered in person here at the event and online for attending our opening ceremony and making it a very exciting event and a success. I also, of course, would like to thank our wonderful speakers today, Professor Carol Gluck and Professor Michael Burdash, for their wonderful discussions of the future and their very kind comments towards the potential of our current institution here. With that, then, I think we will bring today's events to an end. Thank you very much, and I certainly hope to be able to interact with everyone in the future from our new center and cooperate. All right, thank you very much.